"Please, just make it quick," she said, but the cowboy lowered his gun and offered his hand instead. Dry Willow, New Mexico Territory, November 14, 1879. The wind cut like iron filings. It slid through the grass and rattled the loose wire along my fence line, each note sharp enough to find the bone. I'd been walking the perimeter since sundown, checking for breaks, hammering nails with a half-dead lantern swinging from my hand. That's what my nights were: hammer, wind, silence. Nothing out here ever changed unless it was dying. My name's Jonas McCrae. Used to ride with the cavalry before my leg caught a bullet in the San Carlos raid. These days I kept to my land a mile off the old trail, just me, my horse, and the fences that gave me a reason not to drink myself to dust. That night, I heard something that didn't belong to the land. Not the wind, not a coyote, something softer, human, a scrape, then a thud, like a body giving out. I froze, one hand on the post, listening. The lantern flame shook, shadows breaking over the fence. Then I heard it again, a low sound, halfway between breath and pain. I turned toward the dry wash that cut through the back of my property. My boots sank in sand as I walked, the noise getting clearer with every step. When I reached the wash, the moonlight spilled down the slope, silvering the rocks. That's when I saw her. A woman lay face down near the creek bed, her hands bound behind her with rope, wrists swollen and raw. The hem of her dress was torn, streaked with dust and blood. Her hair, long and black as pitch, tangled across her shoulders and into the dirt. She was barely moving, just small tremors running through her body like a dying horse. For a long second, I thought she was dead. Then she lifted her head, slow and heavy, and I caught a glimpse of her face, bronze skin marked by dirt and a faint bruise at her temple. Her eyes met mine, dark, wide, full of something between fear and disbelief. I stood there, the hammer still in my hand, feeling the cold bite through my coat. The first thought that came wasn't pity, it was suspicion. Apache. Maybe a decoy. Maybe a trick to draw a bullet out of a fool. I'd seen worse along the border. But then she tried to move, her arms jerking against the rope until her breath broke into a whimper. The sound tore through the wind like it had been meant for me alone. I stepped closer without thinking. The rope was thick rawhide, cinched tight. Whoever tied it knew their cruelty. I knelt beside her, the smell of sweat and dirt thick in the air. She flinched when I reached for my knife, her body tensing like she expected the blade to go somewhere else. "Easy," I muttered. My voice sounded strange in the night, too human for the place. The knife bit clean through the knots. The rope fell away, and she gasped as blood rushed back to her hands. Her arms folded tight against her chest, her body shaking hard enough to rattle her teeth. "You can move?" I asked. No answer, just the faintest nod. I offered her my canteen. She looked at it, then at me, eyes full of questions I didn't have words for. She drank like she'd forgotten what water tasted like. When she tried to stand, her knees gave out, and I caught her before she hit the ground. She was light, too light. Her skin was cold, her pulse quick under my hand. The moment I touched her, the whole desert seemed to hush. Even the wind held its breath. I didn't know who she was, or what brought her here bound and broken, but leaving her there would have been the same as killing her myself. I'd done enough of that in my time. I lifted her, awkward with my bad leg, and started back toward the cabin. Each step sounded loud in the emptiness, boots and sand, the soft drag of fabric, the faint hitch of her breath against my shoulder. When the cabin came into sight, the lantern light leaking through the cracks in the shutters, I stopped at the threshold. For a heartbeat, I hesitated. Bringing her inside meant crossing back into something I'd sworn off years ago: responsibility, mercy, trust, things that got a man killed quicker than bullets. But she stirred in my arms, whispering something in a language older than the fences and the rifles and the wars that made men like me. Her voice cracked, but there was prayer in it. Maybe thanks, maybe fear. I pushed the door open with my shoulder and carried her inside. The cabin felt smaller with her in it. I laid her down near the stove, threw tinder into the firebox, and struck a spark. When the flame caught, the light crawled over her face. She was younger than I thought, 20, maybe 25, but the exhaustion carved her like she'd lived twice that. I wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes followed every move, wary but awake. When she tried to speak, the words cracked apart like dry wood. No one come back? She managed. No one's coming, I said. Not tonight. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters again. I looked at her hands, swollen and cut, and felt the old shame stir, the kind that doesn't fade with years or whiskey. I'd seen too many like her left to die so men could tell stories about honor later. That wasn't going to happen on my land. I set another log on the fire and sat down across from her, rifle within reach, the silence between us thick but not empty. For the first time in years, there was another heartbeat in that cabin besides mine. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. When morning came, the light crept slow and thin through the cracks in the cabin walls. I woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. For a moment, I forgot she was there, the woman I'd carried in from the cold night before. Tala, she'd said her name was, voice barely a whisper before sleep took her. She lay curled near the stove, wrapped in the old wool blanket I'd given her, her dark hair spilling across the floorboards like ink. The fire had gone to ash. The air was cold enough that my breath showed. I moved quietly, stirring the coals and feeding them slivers of kindling until the flame caught. As the cabin filled with warmth again, I looked at her and thought about how she'd come to my door half dead, tied and discarded by the kind of men I'd spent years trying to forget. She stirred then, eyes fluttering open, wide and wary. The moment she saw me, her body tensed. I held my hands up slightly, palms open. "You're safe here," I said. My voice came rough with sleep. "No one's coming." Her gaze flicked to the rifle leaning against the wall, then back to me. I saw the fear in her, but also the fight. She didn't answer, only drew the blanket tighter around herself. I poured a little water into a tin cup and slid it toward her. "Drink," I said. "Slow." She reached for it, hesitant, then drank like a person who hadn't known mercy in days. Some spilled down her chin, but she didn't stop. When she finished, she looked down at her hands. Rope burns ringed her wrists, raw and red. "Who tied you?" I asked. She flinched at the question. For a long time, she said nothing. Then her voice came small, cracked. "Men, raiders, from South Trail. I run." She pulled the blanket closer. "They follow." I nodded. "They won't find you here." It wasn't a promise I could guarantee, but saying it out loud made it feel real. She studied me then long enough that I had to look away. I wasn't used to being seen, not after years alone. The wind rattled the walls, the same way it had last night. Outside, frost silvered the grass. Inside, I set a pan on the stove, poured in beans and a strip of salt pork. She watched me in silence, her eyes following every move. When I set a plate in front of her, she hesitated, as if expecting a price. "Eat," I said. She did, fast at first, then slower, careful not to waste a bite. Hunger, fear, gratitude, all of it showed plain on her face. When she finished, I asked, "You from a tribe nearby?" She nodded slowly. "White Mountain Apache," she said. Her voice was steadier now, though quiet. "My people far north now, I no go back." She looked at her hands again. "They say I cursed." The words sat between us. I didn't ask why. I'd learned long ago that some stories carried their own weight. "You can rest here until you heal," I told her. "Then we'll see what comes next." Her eyes lifted to mine, uncertain. "You not sell me?" The question hit like a blow. I swallowed hard. "No." She looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to find the lie. When she didn't, she nodded once, small and solemn. Later, when the light had grown brighter, I went outside to check the traps. The wind cut sharp, carrying the smell of sage and old wood smoke. The ground was still frozen, but the sun had begun to warm it. As I walked the line, I kept thinking about the woman in my cabin, how her voice trembled when she spoke, how she'd looked at the rifle like it was another kind of man. I'd brought home strays before, a wounded horse, a hawk once, broken-winged. but never someone like her. When I came back, she was standing by the window, wrapped in the blanket, staring out. The firelight played along her cheek, and I could see color returning to her skin. "You shouldn't stand yet," I said. "You'll fall over." She turned, lips pressing tight, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner. "I strong," she said. "Not break easy." That made me almost smile back. "Didn't say you were weak." I limped toward the table, setting down a rabbit from the trap. She flinched at the sight of blood, then steadied herself. "You kill?" she asked. "For food," I said simply. "For nothing else anymore." She nodded, eyes softening. "War takes everything," she murmured. I looked up. "You've seen war." She nodded again, her gaze far away. "Soldiers burn village. Long time. I small girl. I run. Always run." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with things neither of us could name. I cleaned the rabbit, washed my hands, and set water to boil. When I looked up, she was still watching me like she was trying to decide if I was another kind of danger or something else entirely. As the day passed, the cabin warmed. The smell of stew filled the air. Tala began to move about, slower now but steadier, gathering wood, sweeping the floor with a branch broom she'd made herself. She didn't ask permission. I didn't stop her. It felt like the right kind of silence between us, two people doing what needed doing. By late afternoon, I stepped outside to chop wood. The axe bit clean into the logs, each swing steady. From inside, I could hear her humming a soft tune, low and lilting, something ancient. It wrapped around the sound of the wind, filled the emptiness I'd lived with for years. I paused, listening. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. When the sun dipped low, I came back inside. Tala had cleaned the cabin more than I thought possible. The dirt floor was smooth, the stove shining faintly. She stood by the fire, holding the blanket around her shoulders, her face calm. I nodded toward the corner. "You did all that?" She nodded. "I work. I stay busy. No think too much." I understood that better than I wanted to admit. We ate together that night. Not much, just rabbit and beans, but it felt different than any meal I'd had in years. Afterward, she sat by the stove, running her fingers over the edge of the blanket, lost in thought. I leaned back on the cot, listening to the fire crackle. The weight of her presence settled in the room like warmth. After a while, she said quietly, "You live alone long time?" I nodded. "Since the war." "Why?" she asked. "Because people hurt worse than bullets," I said. She looked at me, eyes sad but not pitying. "Not all people," she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't have one. Outside, the wind pushed against the boards, and the stars came out cold, bright, endless. I thought about her words, about how easy it had been to believe the world was nothing but pain. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was still something left worth knowing. When she finally lay down near the fire again, I sat awake, listening to her breathe. The sound was steady, like the rhythm of a heartbeat I'd forgotten how to hear. For the first time in years, the silence in my cabin wasn't mine alone. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The morning after the first quiet night felt different. The air outside had the clean bite of frost, the kind that sharpens a man's thoughts. I stepped out early, boots crunching the ground, and saw the tracks we'd left yesterday leading down to the creek. No new prints, no riders. The land was holding still, as if waiting. Tala was already awake when I came back in, crouched near the stove, her hair loose, the blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked at me and spoke softly. "You go again today?" I nodded. "Fence line still needs mending. West side's falling apart." "I come," she said immediately. The tone wasn't a request. It was steady, almost defiant. I studied her a moment, the way her hands gripped the blanket, the faint bruises on her wrists still visible but fading. "You sure?" I asked. "Cold out there." She nodded once, already reaching for the old boots I'd found. We walked together into the pale morning light. The ground was stiff with frost. The sun crept slow over the ridge, painting the desert in dull gold. I carried the tools and wire. She carried herself with quiet strength. For a long stretch, we didn't speak. Only the wind and the sound of our steps filled the silence. Every now and then, I'd glance at her. Her face was calm, her eyes focused. The fear I'd seen that first night was gone, replaced by something tougher resolve. When we reached the broken fence, I handed her a hammer and started setting the posts. She watched me first, then mirrored my movements, careful, deliberate. Her small hands swung with surprising force, each strike echoing across the empty land. I couldn't help but feel something shift inside me watching her work, this woman who had been cast out, beaten, left to die, now standing here, rebuilding beside me. Around midday, we stopped to rest. I pulled a strip of jerky from my coat and handed it over. She took it, chewed slow. The wind carried the faint smell of sage and dust. "You work like Scout," she said. I glanced at her. "Used to be," I answered. "Before I learned the only thing harder than war is living after it." She didn't reply, just nodded as if she understood too well. After a moment, she said quietly, "My husband, he was good man once. War take him too, not his body, his mind." She looked toward the hills, eyes distant. "When he die, I think I die too. But I not. I walk." Her words cut through the quiet, heavy but honest. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I stood, picked up the hammer, and went back to work. She joined me, and we finished the fence before the light began to fade. The rhythm of our labor felt almost sacred, two broken souls making something whole again. On the walk back, the sky burned deep orange over the horizon. I caught her humming again, that same low tune from before. It rolled soft and sad through the air, but it didn't sound hopeless. When we reached the cabin, I felt the same strange peace I'd felt when she first smiled, like the world might still hold something worth saving. That night, after supper, we sat near the fire. The warmth filled the small space. She worked at sewing the sleeve of my old coat, her head bowed, the lamplight sliding across her face. I watched her hands move, steady and practiced, and found myself remembering my wife the way she used to hum when she mended things. I hadn't thought of her face in years, not clearly. The memories came now, not as pain, but as a kind of echo. Tala looked up once, catching me watching her. She didn't look away this time. "You loved her," she said simply. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Still do, in a way. But she's been gone a long time." "Death not take love," she said softly. "Only change it." I didn't answer. The truth in her words left no space for speech. She returned to sewing, and I sharpened my knife, the scrape of steel against stone filling the room. Outside, the wind rattled the boards. I could hear the faint creak of the fence in the distance, sound that used to mean solitude, now meaning something else entirely. Later, when she finished, she handed the coat to me. "Good as new," she said with a small smile. "Better than I deserve," I replied. "No," she said firmly. "We both deserve better." Her words settled deep. Before I could answer, a faint noise broke the calm, a distant rumble, soft but unmistakable. Hooves. I stood fast, rifle in hand, moving to the door. Tala followed, eyes wide but steady. We waited, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, then faded again. Just riders passing the trail, maybe. Or maybe not. I stayed still until silence returned. When I turned, Tala was standing close. The lamplight caught her face, half shadow, half glow. She reached up slowly, hesitantly, and touched the scar on my temple. "You fight many battles," she whispered. I swallowed, throat tight. "Too many." "You still fight," she said, her hand dropping back to her side. "But now not for killing, for keeping." Her words hit harder than I expected. I stared at her, at the way the light danced in her eyes. She didn't flinch. I'd spent years believing the only thing left for me was to endure. Now, for the first time, I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to protect, to build, to live. When she turned to stoke the fire, I caught myself watching her again, the way the firelight curved along her shoulder, the slow rise and fall of her breath. I forced myself to look away, ashamed of the thought. But something had changed in that cabin, in both of us. The silence between us wasn't the old, empty kind. It was alive, waiting. The next morning came gray and brittle, the sky bruised with coming snow. I woke to the sound of her moving about fetching water, grinding beans, her voice humming low. The smell of firewood and coffee filled the air. For a moment, I thought of the old days when such mornings had meaning. Maybe they did again. After breakfast, we went outside to check the traps. The land stretched endless and pale, frost glittering on the brush. Tala moved ahead of me, quick and sure-footed despite the boots too big for her. She found the first trap empty, the second holding a rabbit. She freed it with practiced care, her hands gentle. "Life small," she said, "but still life." I nodded. "That's enough sometimes." We carried the catch back, skinning and cleaning it together. The cabin filled with the smell of wood, smoke, and stew. It felt almost like peace. When night came again, she sat near the fire sewing a patch on the blanket, and I sat opposite, oiling my rifle. The firelight flickered between us, drawing the room in close. Finally, she spoke. "When I come to your door, I think I die." I looked at her, the memory sharp as glass. "I thought so too," I said. She smiled faintly. "Now I think maybe I live again." I leaned back, staring into the flames. "You and me both." Her eyes met mine, calm, steady. Then we not alone anymore. For a long time, I didn't move. The words filled the space between us, simple and certain. And in that small cabin, with winter pressing against the walls, I knew something had changed for good. Whatever storm was coming, we would face it together. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you." The next morning came gray and cold, the kind of light that never quite warms the land. I woke before dawn, listening to the hollow quiet that comes before trouble. Tala was already up, kneeling by the stove, feeding and kindling with slow, steady hands. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "They come soon." Her certainty hit harder than any sound outside. I stood, pulled on my coat, and checked the rifle. "Then we'll be ready." "No." We spent the morning patching the shutters and bracing the door with a plank. Tala moved beside me without needing to be told, hammering nails with a rhythm that matched mine. She worked barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. When she paused to wipe her brow, I noticed the rope scars had started to fade, faint lines now, not wounds. Healing had begun, even if neither of us said the word. By midday, clouds rolled over the ridge, dull and heavy. I saw movement, far-off dust rising like breath from the land. "Riders," I said. Tala came to my side, eyes narrowing. 4, maybe 5 men, their silhouettes small against the horizon. "Inside," I ordered. We barred the door and waited. The minutes dragged like hours. Tala sat near the window slit, rifle in her hands. It was my wife's old gun, cleaned and oiled after years of dust. She held it right firm, but not afraid. I loaded cartridges, every click echoing too loud in the still cabin. The riders didn't come close that day. They circled wide, testing. I saw the flash of sunlight off their gun barrels before they disappeared into the canyon. It wasn't an attack. It was a promise. That night, the wind picked up again. The fire cast restless shadows across the walls. I couldn't sleep, so I sat sharpening my knife. Tala lay on the floor, eyes open, watching the flames. "Why you stay here alone?" she asked quietly. "No town, no people." I thought about lying, but the truth came easier than I expected. Because people take more than they give. Out here, the land's honest. Hard, but honest. She nodded slowly. "Land takes too. My husband died under Sunday, no grave, only dust." Her voice didn't tremble, but something broke behind it. "His family say I bring death. They tie me, leave me for men to find." The words hung like smoke. I set the knife down, jaw tight. "You're not cursed, Tala. You just ran into cowards." Then, her eyes lifted to mine, reflecting the firelight. "And you? You run from ghosts?" I hesitated. "Used to, not sure it worked." For a long while, We just sat in that uneasy peace, the storm outside building. Then, faint at first, the sound came hooves, distant but real. I rose and peered through the window. Lanterns glimmered far down the valley. "They're coming." Tala stood, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. She didn't tremble. "Then we fight." I nodded once. "We hold the cabin. They cross the fence. They fall." The first shot cracked just after midnight. A bullet slammed into the doorframe, splintering wood inches from my head. Tala crouched low, aiming through the gap. I returned fire, the rifle kicking against my shoulder. Muzzles flashed in the dark beyond the fence line. Horses screamed. Another shot tore through the window, shattering glass across the floor. "Tala, stay low," I barked. She didn't answer, just fired once. A shape fell outside, a man's curse cut short. Her hands were steady, her face calm. I felt a fierce pride I hadn't known in years. The fight lasted minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The air inside filled with smoke and dust. The smell of powder burned sharp in my nose. My leg throbbed, but I held steady. I heard one rider yell to pull back, another curse, then hooves pounding away. I waited, finger on the trigger, till silence settled again. When I opened the door, the yard was empty but for hoof prints, and a dark stain in the dirt. One of them hadn't ridden far. I stared out into the desert, knowing the others would be back with more. The land never forgot weakness. "They'll come again," Tala said behind me. "Yes," I answered, "but not tonight." Back inside, I slumped onto the cot, the rifle across my knees. Tala stood near the stove, watching me with that same unreadable expression. Then she crossed the room, slow but sure, and knelt in front of me. "You fight for me," she said softly. I fought because I had to. Her hand rested lightly on my arm. "No, you choose." I looked at her, the firelight flickering in her eyes. She was right. Somewhere between the hammering and the gunfire, I'd made a choice. Not just to fight, but to stay alive for something other than survival. "You're safe here," I said finally. "No one will take you again." "Over." She studied me, her gaze long and careful. Then she nodded, rising. She pulled another blanket from the shelf and set it near the cot. "You sleep now," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Tomorrow we fix again." I watched her move through the dim light, gathering what little order the cabin still had. Every motion spoke of purpose, calm, deliberate. She had lived too long in fear to waste energy on it now. When she finally lay down near the stove, the firelight danced over her face, softening the hard lines that life had carved there. Outside, the wind moaned low across the ridge. I could hear the creak of the fence and the faint whimper of a horse in the dark distance. Somewhere out there, the men were tending to their wounded and plotting their return. I'd seen this kind of standoff before, in war, the quiet before the storm that decides everything. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, smoke curling, her silhouette by the fire, the look she gave me when she said, "You choose." Maybe she didn't mean it the way I heard it, but the words stuck. I hadn't chosen much in years. The land had made choices for me, where to settle, what to eat, how to live. But that night, with her alive beside me, I'd chosen to fight again. Near dawn, I heard her stir. She rose quietly and stepped outside. I followed, limping to the door. She stood by the fence, looking out over the valley, her hair loose in the wind. The first light touched her face. She turned to me, eyes bright with something new, something fierce. "We not die here," she said. "No," I said. "Not today." The words felt like a vow. Maybe they were. When she came back in, she started boiling water, washing the floorboards where glass had scattered. I sat watching her move, realizing the cabin had changed. It no longer felt like mine alone. Every sound, her footsteps, the crackle of fire, the soft hum under her breath, filled spaces I hadn't known were empty. Later that morning, while we worked to mend what had broken, I caught her glancing toward me, quick and shy. I almost smiled, but stopped myself. There was still danger out there, still blood in the dirt. But for the first time, I felt something else, stirring a reason to rebuild rather than just survive. If you're watching on TV, Don't hesitate, grab your phone, and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. When I looked back toward the horizon, the wind was lifting dust across the valley. I could almost see the trail the riders had taken, fading west into the canyon. The land stretched out silent and endless, as if waiting to see what we would do next. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Morning came slow and quiet, like the land was holding its breath after the night's storm. The yard was streaked with dust and blood where the riders had been. I limped through the cold air, checking the fence line, counting the posts still standing. The sun rose over the ridge, red and hard, burning away the mist that clung to the low ground. The smell of smoke and iron still hung thick in the air, a reminder of what the night had taken and what it had spared. Tala stepped outside barefoot, wrapped in the blanket. Her face was pale but calm, the dark circles under her eyes deep but not hollow. She looked at the trail leading north. "They go?" she asked. For now, I leaned on the fence, watching the horizon. "They won't risk another try for a while." She came to stand beside me, the blanket brushing my arm. "You hurt?" "Not bad." I flexed my hand, the knuckles raw from recoil. "You?" She smiled faintly. "Alive." "Oh." The word hung between us, simple but full. We stood there a while, letting the wind wash through us. For the first time since that night by the dry wash, there was no fear in her eyes, only a kind of tired peace. I realized the land didn't look the same anymore. The fences, the cabin, even the silence, it all felt different now, less like prison, more like promise. Back inside, we cooked what was left of the deer meat, the fire filling the room with warmth. Tala hummed low under her breath, some old song that rolled like river water. I found myself listening, not for danger this time, but for the sound of life returning. When the smell of food spread through the cabin, something inside me eased, like a hand unclenching after years. She looked up at me once, eyes soft. "You no send me away?" I shook my head. "You can stay as long as you want, or leave when you choose. That's the only law here." Her smile deepened, small but sure. "Then I stay." We ate in silence after that, both knowing what it meant without saying it aloud. When the meal was done, she took my hand just for a moment, but it felt like something sacred passing between us. Her palm was rough, scarred, but warm, a living thing. I'd spent years thinking the world had taken everything worth keeping. Now, watching her move through the cabin, tending the fire, patching a coat that wasn't even hers, I knew I'd been wrong. Some things the world can't steal, they have to be given. After lunch, we worked together outside, stacking wood, fixing the boards that had cracked under gunfire. The sun was high and sharp, and dust rose around our boots. She laughed once when I cursed at a splinter, the sound catching both of us by surprise. I hadn't heard laughter on this land in a decade. It startled me, like birds scattering from an empty tree. Later, as shadows grew long, we sat on the porch steps. The horizon burned orange, and the hills turned black against it. Tala's hair lifted in the wind, brushing my shoulder. "This place," she said quietly, "it not cruel like before." "It's still cruel," I said, "just quieter about it." She tilted her head, thinking, maybe it wait for us to make peace with it. Her words sank deep. The desert didn't change for anyone, but maybe we were the ones who could change how we lived inside it. I looked toward the ridge, the same ridge where death had come last night, and saw it differently, still harsh, still empty, but no longer alone. That night, the cold pressed close again. We sat by the stove, watching sparks jump in the firebox. Tala leaned her head against my shoulder, her voice a whisper. "You think we safe now?" I looked toward the window, the stars sharp and cold against the dark. "Safe enough for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll see." She nodded, her fingers finding mine. For a long time we didn't speak. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was full. I could feel her breath against my sleeve, her heart steady. Out there, the wind moved over the land, whispering through the broken grass, like it had a story to tell. After a while she said, "You fight many years, you tired?" I nodded. Most days. Then rest now, she said. You not alone. Her voice was soft but sure, like she was speaking to the wound itself. I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest, somewhere near the place that had forgotten how to hope. When the fire burned down to coals, she spoke again. You think God still watch us? I looked at her, then at the horizon beyond the window. If he is, maybe he finally decided to let us start over. She smiled, small but bright. Then we live. Yeah, I said softly. We live. The night held steady, the desert breathing slow outside our walls. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to count the hours till dawn. I just sat there, listening to her breathe, the warmth of the fire spilling over us both. The sound of her heartbeat became part of the quiet. When dawn came again, I stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. The land stretched endless and wild, but not empty. Tala joined me, standing close, her hand finding mine without hesitation. The wind blew through the cottonwoods, carrying the faint scent of smoke and cedar. A hawk circled high above, calling once before gliding west. We watched until it disappeared into the Sunday. She turned to me, her eyes catching the light. You stay here long before me. You stay longer now? I'll stay, I said, as long as there's something worth keeping. She smiled, and that was answer enough. We turned back toward the cabin, the fire smoke curling into the sky behind us, like a signal to no one and everyone at once. The air was cold, but it carried promise, the kind that makes a man believe he still belongs to the earth. Later, as we sat eating by the fire, she spoke again. When I first come here, I think you ghost. I smiled faintly. Maybe I was. She laughed softly, her eyes warm. Not now. Look. We finished our meal, and she began humming that tune again, low, old, full of sorrow and grace. I didn't know the words, but I felt them. It was a song for survivors, for people who'd lost everything and still chose to keep walking. I leaned back, closing my eyes, listening to her voice mix with the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. For the first time in a long time, I understood what peace felt like, not the absence of trouble, but the presence of something good enough to make the trouble worth facing. The story of Jonas McCrae and Tala was never about saving or being saved. It was about remembering how to live when the world tries to make you forget, about finding grace in a land that gives nothing easy. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. If you've ever wondered what it means to heal, to love without chains, to trust without fear, that's what the Wild West still teaches. And that's what cowboy love stories, Wild West love, and Wild West love story are all about. Finding something worth staying for. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment, Amen, below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.